The day they brought 100 princesses to the Obsidian Palace, I was scrubbing floors. That's where this story starts. Not in a throne room, not in some glittering ballroom with chandeliers made of captured starlight. It starts with me, Sira Voss, 23 years old, on my knees with a bristle brush in my hand and soap suds drying on my forearms, trying to get a burn mark off the third corridor's marble tiles before the head steward noticed. I didn't know what was coming. Nobody told the maids anything. Let me back up a little, because to understand what happened, you have to understand what the Obsidian Palace actually was. People on the outside, people who'd never set foot inside its gates, they imagined it like something from an old fairy tale. Towers made of black crystal. Gardens that floated in midair. A king sitting on a throne of living obsidian, surrounded by guards in silver armor. They weren't entirely wrong. But they missed the other half of it. The half that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and recycled air. The half where the heating systems in the East Wing groaned every morning at 3 a.m. like something dying. The half where 47 women in identical gray uniforms moved through corridors before dawn, making sure that by the time anyone important opened their eyes, the world around them looked effortless. That was us, the service staff of the Obsidian Palace. We weren't servants in the old sense. We were contracted employees of the Galactic Crown Estates, which sounded much more dignified until you remembered that the pay scale hadn't been updated in 11 years, and the medical coverage didn't include dental. I'd been working there for 2 years, came in at 19, fresh off a transport shuttle from the Outer Belt settlements. My mother had died the year before. My father had been gone long before that, stationed somewhere along the Cathara border, and never came back. I had my skills, which were modest. I had my hands, which were strong. And I had a letter of recommendation from the District Labor Board that said I was reliable and thorough, which apparently was enough to get me a position scrubbing the floors of the most powerful palace in 7-star systems. I didn't complain. Complaining didn't pay rent. The palace was run by head steward Dorn, a thin man with wireframe optical enhancers and the personality of a door hinge. He had rules about everything: how to fold a linen, how to address a guard, how to walk through a corridor when dignitaries were present, which was a specific heel-toe motion that made no noise and apparently conveyed the appropriate level of invisibility. I learned all of it. I was good at the invisible part especially. My closest friend in the palace was a woman named Yelena. She was from the same Outer Belt cluster as me, but she'd been at the palace for 5 years, which made her practically ancient in service staff terms. She knew everything and everyone. She knew which guard slipped extra rations to the kitchen workers. She knew which advisor to the throne had a gambling problem. She knew that the third basement level wasn't really a storage unit. It was where the king's personal research division had been running experimental energy containment trials for the past 6 months. She also knew before any of us that something massive was coming. 100 princesses, she said to me one morning 3 weeks before it happened. We were in the staff locker room pulling on our gray uniforms. From every sovereign system in the Galactic Compact, 100 of them, all coming here at once. I looked at her. That's not possible. It's already scheduled. I saw the housing assignments. They're converting the entire East Wing. 14 suites aren't enough, so they're retrofitting 6 additional chambers. Why? She looked at me like I was slightly slow. The selection, Sira. The king's been 31 for 6 months now. The council's been pushing for an heir declaration. He can't put it off anymore. I thought about that while I pulled my hair back into the required low bun. He's choosing a queen. He's choosing from 100 queens in waiting. She paused. May the stars have mercy on all of us who have to clean up after them. She wasn't wrong about the cleaning. The princesses arrived over 3 days in waves. Transport vessels ranging from elegant needle-slim diplomatic cruisers to full military escort formations. Some of these women came with warships. Not weapons hot, obviously. This was a selection, not an invasion. But the message was clear. These were women of consequence. Women whose families controlled star systems, trade routes, resource deposits. Women who had grown up knowing that power was something you inherited and then defended with everything you had. I watched the first group arrive from a service corridor window. It was the only window in my section that faced the landing platforms, and technically, we weren't supposed to use it for non-work purposes, but Yelena and I had established a long-standing policy of ignoring that particular rule. They were beautiful. That's the honest thing to say. Not beautiful in a uniform way. They came from 20 different star systems, so they looked as different from each other as planets in the same cluster. But there was a quality to all of them, a kind of luminescence, like they'd been built for public observation. Like every gesture, every angle of their posture had been trained from birth to communicate importance. Princess Vaili of the Sareth system stepped off her cruiser in a coat made of what appeared to be living silk, actual bioluminescent fabric that shifted color with her movement, blues and greens and deep violets. She was tall, strikingly so. Her hair was silver white, which was natural to her species, and her eyes were the amber of old circuit cores. Princess Dasha of Keth 9 wore military medals, actual combat medals, not ceremonial ones. She was compact and deliberate in her movements, and she looked at the palace walls like she was calculating their structural weaknesses out of pure habit. Princess Oru of the floating Isles of Marava was carried out on a hoverplate because her people had adapted over generations to low-gravity environments, and the palace's standard gravity settings required adjustment for her. She had 4 attendants and a force field generator that hummed at a frequency you could feel in your back teeth. There were 97 more after them. I watched them all arrive, and then I went back to scrubbing the 3rd corridor floor, because that burn mark wasn't going to remove itself. The first week of the selection was what I think of now as the display phase. The council had organized a series of events, formal dinners, cultural exhibitions, diplomatic presentations, private audiences. Each princess was given time with the king. Each was evaluated, theoretically, on compatibility metrics that the council had been refining for years. I knew this because we cleaned up after every single event. And let me tell you something about cleaning up after people. You learn things. You see the leftover food on a plate and you can tell whether someone was nervous or just uninterested. You find the notes that get dropped or left behind. You see the way a room looks after someone leaves it, whether they were at ease or performing ease, which are very different things. The dining hall after the first formal dinner looked like a calculated performance had taken place in it. Perfect. Almost aggressively perfect. Plates arranged just so. No one had actually eaten very much, every napkin folded exactly as instructed. Impressive or terrifying, Yelena said, as we gathered the linens. Both, I said. None of them are real in there, she said. They're all presenting themselves, nobody's being anything. I thought she was probably right. I didn't think about the king much in those early days. That sounds strange, maybe. He was the reason for all of this. He was the entire point. But when you work in a palace, the person at the top of the hierarchy is almost abstract. You're aware of his presence the way you're aware of gravity, as a constant force that shapes everything around you without you necessarily thinking about the force itself. King Arin of the Obsidian Throne. I'd seen him at a distance a few times. Tall, taller than most humans, though he was fully human, which was actually notable. The Galactic Compact was genuinely galactic, meaning the throne had been held by different species across different eras, and there was a particular political significance to the fact that the current Alpha King was human. A man from Earth lineage stock, 3 generations removed from the original colony ships, sitting at the center of a 7-system sovereign compact that contained 49 distinct species. The Galactic Council called this historical. The older alien species, the ones who'd been running things before humanity clawed its way into the stars, called it something more complicated. He had dark hair. I noticed that because most of the senior court members had opted for various modifications, enhancement procedures, cosmetic alterations, the kind of thing that announced your access to resources. His hair was natural, just dark brown, kept short. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with armor and everything to do with genetics or training or both. His eyes, I saw his eyes once, early in that first week. He came through a service-adjacent corridor because his official schedule had been altered, and the route change wasn't communicated to my team in time, which meant I was still working when he passed through with 2 of his personal guards. I pressed against the wall, which was the protocol for service staff. Head down, hands still. He didn't look at me. Nobody looks at maids. But I looked at him, just briefly, just the fraction of a second before I looked at the floor. His eyes were gray, a very specific kind of gray, not empty, not cold, but the gray of a sky before a real storm, the kind of gray that means something is coming. He looked tired, not physically, somewhere deeper than that. I went back to my scrubbing. The second week was when the tension started. 100 princesses in one building is not a peaceful thing. I want to be clear about that. These were powerful women from different political traditions, different cultural frameworks, different ideas about what it meant to compete for something. Some of them were raised in systems where direct competition was honorable. Some were raised where it was considered barbaric. Some viewed the other 99 as allies in a shared performance. Some viewed them as enemies. The staff felt it. You can't help but feel it when the air in a building changes. There were incidents, minor ones officially. A princess's personal AI assistant was found to have been tampered with, fed false scheduling information that made her miss a private audience with the king. Another princess's wardrobe was accessed, and certain key garments were treated with a contact substance that caused mild but visible skin discoloration. Not harmful but deeply embarrassing. Head steward Dorn handled these incidents with his usual style, which was to pretend they hadn't happened while simultaneously restructuring the entire security protocol to prevent their recurrence. The princesses who'd been targeted handled it differently. Princess Bailey, whose assistant was tampered with, spent the next 3 days so precisely gracious and composed that it was genuinely unnerving. She was building something. You could feel it. Princess Dasha, who found one of the target substances left in her wardrobe before she used it, simply had her security team run a full forensic analysis, submitted a report to the Palace Council, and continued her schedule without any visible reaction. I respected that one. My actual work during this period was mostly in the East Wing, which was where the princesses were housed. This meant my days got about 40% more complicated, and the walking distance I covered increased significantly. I was doing the corridors by 4 in the morning, the common areas by 6, supporting the dining preparation team through breakfast, and then back to whatever specific cleaning duties had accumulated through the afternoon. It was a lot. But here's the thing about that kind of work: when you do it long enough, you disappear. Not literally, but in people's perception of their environment, service staff become part of the background, like furniture that moves and breathes but doesn't register as something that sees or hears or thinks. I saw and heard a great deal. I heard 2 princesses argue in low galactic about whether the king was even capable of genuine feeling, or whether they were all auditioning for a political alliance that would be called a marriage. I heard an advisor to Princess Bailey instruct her in careful, urgent tones that she needed to create a moment of genuine connection, not just demonstrate her credentials, because the king was, and this is the phrase he used, frustratingly human in his requirements. I heard a princess from the Dren system cry in her chamber at 2 in the morning. Not loud. Quiet, controlled crying, the kind that comes from someone who has been taught that visible emotion is weakness but still has feelings anyway. I left a fresh glass of water outside her door with a small piece of the kitchen's dark sugar candy that Cook always kept in the staff pantry. Just left it there. No note. She never knew who did it. I heard, one evening in the third corridor, a conversation between two of the king's senior advisors that stopped me cold. He's not choosing any of them. He has to choose. The council is clear. The council can be as clear as they like. You've seen him in the audiences. He goes through the motions. He's polite, he's intelligent, he asks good questions, but there's nothing there. No spark. Then we make a recommendation. Vayli, probably. Strategic alliance with Sarath, it's the strongest political case. And he marries a woman he feels nothing for. And we start the next decade's succession planning like it's a supply chain problem. A pause. There's no other option. I kept moving, head down, invisible. I met him properly by accident. 3 weeks into the selection, on a Tuesday morning, in the East Wing's secondary service corridor. I had an equipment cart. He had apparently decided, at 7 in the morning, to take a walk through the least trafficked part of the East Wing without guards or advisors, which was either a security violation or a very deliberate choice to be temporarily unbothered. The corridor was narrow, my cart was wide. We both saw each other at the same moment and both stopped. I immediately moved to flatten myself against the wall and pull the cart as far aside as possible. "I'm sorry, Your Highness. I'll clear the path immediately." "You don't need to do that." His voice was different than I expected. Not different in quality, it was exactly what you'd expect from someone who spent his days commanding rooms. Clear, low, carrying the kind of natural authority that doesn't need to announce itself. But the tone was different. Tired. Human. Not performance-tired the way politicians did when they wanted to seem relatable. Just actually tired. "The corridor's wide enough," he said. "I'll go around." He moved to pass. I kept my head appropriately down, which meant I was looking at the floor, which meant I didn't see the maintenance panel that had been removed from the corridor wall that morning for a scheduled cable inspection. It was propped up against the wall, which was technically a safety violation, but the maintenance team had flagged it for after-hours work, and someone had forgotten to replace the floor marker. He almost walked into it. "The panel," I said without thinking. He stopped, looked at the panel, looked at me. "Left there from this morning's maintenance," I said, and then winced, because I'd just spoken to the Alpha King without being addressed, which was probably 17 different protocol violations. "I apologize, Your Highness. I shouldn't have." "You just saved me from walking face first into a wall panel," he said. "That seems like a reasonable reason to speak." There was something almost dry about the way he said it, not sarcastic, just honest. "Yes, sir," I said. "What's your name?" "Nobody asks maids their names," I blinked. Sira Voss, East Wing service staff I'm sorry for." "You keep apologizing." Yes." I stopped. I wasn't sure what to do with that observation. He studied me for a moment. Not the way you get studied by someone who's cataloging you. More like he was just looking. Like he hadn't had a reason to just look at something ordinary in a long time. "The burn mark on the third corridor floor," he said. I stared. "I'm sorry." "You've been working on it for 3 weeks. Did you ever get it out?" I had absolutely no idea how he knew about that. "Yes," I said, 2 days ago. Specialized solvent compound. And then, because apparently I had lost my mind entirely, I added, "It required a lot of patience." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, more like the beginning of one that didn't quite get there. "I imagine it did," he said. Then he went around my cart and continued down the corridor. I stood there for a moment with my hands on the cart handles, thinking that I might be dreaming, and then I got back to work because the East Wing common area wasn't going to clean itself. Yelena noticed something was different that evening. "You've got that look," she said, at dinner in the staff commons. "What look?" "The look where you're thinking about something but you don't want to tell me about it." "I don't have a look. Sira, I have known you for 2 years. You have a look." I told her about the corridor. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, which was unusual. Yelena was many things, but quiet wasn't usually one of them. "He knew about the burn mark," she said finally. "That's the part that surprised me too. That means he notices things." She picked at her food. "The king notices things that aren't in his official vision. He notices what's happening in the background. He was probably just walking past one morning. He's not scheduled to walk past the third corridor. That's not on any route I've seen." I didn't say anything to that. "Be careful," she said, not ominous, just practical. "I'm a maid," I said. "He spoke to me for 40 seconds. That's not something to be careful about." She gave me a look that said she wasn't convinced, but she let it go. Part 2. What happens in the background? The fourth week was when the galactic political machinery showed up in full force. 3 diplomatic envoys arrived, not attached to any of the princesses, but representing the broader interests of the Compact's governing council. They set up in the palace's formal meeting suite and began what could only be described as lobbying. For which princess? For which alliance? For which strategic future the Obsidian Throne's choice would anchor? This was apparently normal. "It's how it's always been done," Yelena explained. "The king chooses, but he doesn't choose in a vacuum. The council has to be able to live with the choice. If he picks someone politically incoherent, they make his life extremely difficult. And if he picks someone they hate, they make his life impossible." She paused. "Within the structures of compact law, of course, subtly, persistently, the kind of opposition that doesn't look like opposition." I thought about the tired look in his gray eyes. "That sounds exhausting," I said. "Being king of 7-star systems is probably not a relaxing job," Yelena said. The princesses had begun to differentiate themselves in more active ways by this point. Some focused on formal demonstrations. Princess Dasha organized a military tactical presentation that had 3 of the council members genuinely impressed, though whether any of that translated to the king's personal interest was unclear. Princess Vali hosted an intimate gathering where she demonstrated a Sarath cultural practice involving memory-sharing technology, a device that allowed 2 people to briefly experience a shared sensation. Several advisors attended this and reported it was extraordinary. Some focused on the smaller moments, engineered spontaneity, chance encounters in the palace gardens, walks timed across paths with the king's afternoon route. Some focused on the political angle purely, meeting more with the council than with the king himself, building the case through institutional channels. I watched all of it from corridors and service passages, and the periphery of rooms I was cleaning. And I noticed something. When the king was in those spaces, the formal presentations, the engineered encounters, the diplomatic showcases, he was present, fully, professionally present. He said the right things. He asked good questions. He demonstrated genuine intelligence and engaged with what was being shown to him. But he wasn't moved by any of it. I knew what moved looked like. You learn it in this kind of work, watching people across a room when they don't know they're being watched. Moved is when a person's face changes slightly before they've chosen how to respond. It's a half-second of something real before the managed reaction arrives. It wasn't happening in any of these encounters. The advisors who'd spoken in the third corridor were right. He was going through the motions. The second time I spoke to the king, it was in the palace library. I shouldn't have been there at the hour I was. The library was scheduled for service staff access between 5 and 7 a.m., outside of which we were to request special entry for specific tasks. I'd left a cleaning caddy behind by mistake that afternoon and gone back for it at 8 in the evening because I needed it for the following morning's schedule, and I was worried someone would move it. The library was supposed to be empty. The schedule said the king had a dinner engagement until 9. The dinner engagement had apparently ended early. He was at one of the long reading tables, surrounded by projection files, holographic documents arranged in layers around him, the blue-white glow of data illuminating the lower half of his face. He was reading with the focus of someone who actually reads, not someone performing the idea of reading. I reached for my caddy as quietly as possible. My fingers had just closed around the handle when one of the projection files shifted with a soft sound, and I realized he'd adjusted it, which meant he was awake and not, in fact, unaware of my presence. "Sira Voss," he said. He didn't look up immediately. My heart did something inconvenient. "Your Highness." "I apologize for the intrusion. I left my equipment by mistake." "You don't need to narrate your reason for being here," he said, and now he did look up. "I'm not going to have you disciplined for retrieving your equipment." "Thank you, sir." He studied me for a moment in that way from the corridor, just looking, not calculating. "You've been at the palace 2 years." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Before that, the outer belt." I was genuinely startled now. "How do you yes? The Cathara belt settlements, how do you know that?" "I read staff files occasionally." I didn't know what to do with that information. All of them. The ones that seem interesting. There was a pause in which I absolutely did not know what to say. I was standing in the palace library at 8 in the evening, with the Alpha King reading my file to me from memory, and I had a cleaning caddy in one hand. "My file is interesting. Your recommendation letter says you're reliable and thorough," he said, "which is something a district labor board says when they're trying to be helpful but don't really know what to say. But then I watched you spend 3 weeks on a burn mark that most people would have given up on after 3 days and reported as permanent damage. So I thought maybe reliable and thorough was an understatement." I looked at him for a moment. "You watched me work on the burn mark." "I walk the palace corridors sometimes at odd hours." He paused, and something crossed his face that might have been the closest thing to embarrassed I'd ever seen on a king. "Sometimes I need to move through spaces that aren't arranged for me. It helps me think." "I understand that," I said, before I could think about whether to say it. He tilted his head. "Do you?" "The outer belt settlements are small. When I needed to think about something, I'd walk the maintenance causeways. No one arranged those for anything, they were just space." I caught myself. "I'm sorry, you didn't ask." "I know I didn't ask," he said. "I also know I would have liked to." The silence that followed that was a specific kind, not uncomfortable, something else. "I should go," I said. "Yes," he said, "you probably should." I went. I walked back through the service corridor to the staff wing, and I sat on the edge of my cot for a long time without doing anything. I told Yelena the next morning. She listened without interrupting, which was even more unusual than her previous silence. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He reads staff files," she said. "Apparently. He walks the corridors at night." "Yes." "He remembered your name from a 40-second conversation a week ago." "Yes." "And he told you he would have liked you to keep talking." "That's what he said." Yelena set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Sira." "I know. This is." "I know, Yelena. There are 100 princesses in this building. I am extremely aware of that." She looked at me for a long time. "I'm not going to tell you to be careful again. You know to be careful. You're the most careful person I know." She picked up her cup again. I'm just going to say that the world is strange and sometimes it's stranger than you expect, and that's not always a bad thing. I nodded. Also, she said, if head steward Dorn ever finds out, we are both absolutely finished here. Nothing is happening, I said. Sure, she said, nothing. Part 3: Complications. The political machinery escalated in week 5. The Galactic Council's envoys submitted a formal recommendation to the King's Advisory Board, Princess Vaili of Sarath. The strategic case was comprehensive. The Sarath system controlled 4 major hyperlane junctions, had a standing naval force that would double the compact's military reach, and had been in productive diplomatic alignment with the throne for 2 generations. Vaili herself was, by every metric the envoys could construct, an ideal queen. The council accepted the recommendation formally and presented it to the king. His response, as reported in the administrative channels, which Yelena had sources in, was, "I've noted the recommendation." That was it. That was the whole response. The envoys were not pleased. The incident with Princess Oru happened on a Thursday. Her gravity support system had been functioning on supplemental power for 3 days, a minor maintenance issue that her attendants had reported, but that had gotten delayed in the palace's service queue, which was overwhelmed during the selection period. The delay wasn't anyone's deliberate failing. It was just the gap between need and capacity that happens when a building is operating at 200% of its normal activity level. On Thursday, the supplemental power system failed during a formal gathering in the West Hall. It didn't fail completely or catastrophically. Oru's suit had backup systems, as all such equipment did. But the backup systems engaged with a jolt that was jarring and disorienting, and in the moment of the failure before the backup caught, she lost altitude. She didn't fall far, maybe 40 centimeters before the backup engaged, but it was visible to everyone in the West Hall, and it was frightening, and the sound she made was small and involuntary and entirely human. The hall had approximately 30 people in it: princesses, advisors, council members, 3 guards, and me. I was clearing a service station at the far end. Most people froze for the half-second of the failure. That's normal. Human response to sudden, unexpected events involves a brief processing pause. The king was across the hall. He moved in that half-second. I don't know how to describe it exactly except to say that he was across the hall and then he was below her, hands up, not catching her because the backup engaged and she didn't fall that far, but positioned so that if the backup hadn't engaged, he would have been there. He didn't think about it. It wasn't a calculated action. It was the same kind of movement I'd made when I reached out without thinking to warn him about the wall panel. The room processed what had happened. Several people began speaking at once. Attendants rushed to Oru. The head of palace maintenance appeared from somewhere, already apologizing. The king said nothing. He just stood for a moment near Oru while she steadied herself and her attendants checked her systems, and then he said, quietly, to her and no one else, "I should have made sure your systems were prioritized. That was my failure." Princess Oru looked at him with an expression I couldn't read from across the hall. Then she said something in her language, which wasn't translated by the room's standard systems because it was too soft and too dialect-specific. But whatever it was made him nod once, very simply. I finished clearing the service station and left before anyone thought to notice I'd been there. That evening, I was in the East Wing corridor later than I should have been. A spillage emergency in one of the adjoining rooms had added 2 hours to my shift when I heard footsteps I'd started to recognize. He walked with a particular cadence, not heavy, not forceful, deliberate. I kept working. There wasn't much to do about it. He stopped near me. I didn't look up immediately. "The maintenance queue," he said. "How backed up is it?" I processed this for a moment. For East Wing service requests, 4 to 6 days currently. For technical systems, I believe it's similar, though I'm not on the technical team. 4 to 6 days, he said, more to himself than to me. The palace is operating at unusual capacity, I said. The teams are trying. I know, he was quiet for a moment. Today shouldn't have happened. I kept my voice neutral, professional. Princess Oru appears to be unharmed. That's not the point. The point is it happened. He paused. I spend too much time in formal engagements and not enough time understanding what the palace actually needs to function. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to respond to that. I responded anyway. The palace functions because the people in it understand their jobs and do them even when the resources are stretched. He looked at me. That sounds like a judgment. No, sir, it's just, I thought about it. In the outer belt settlements, the administration was always in the formal meetings. The actual infrastructure, the water systems, the thermal management, the food distribution, it ran because of the people who ran it, regardless of whether the administration understood what they were doing. And you think that's fine? I think that's how it is, I said. Whether it should be different is a separate question. He looked at me for a long time. You have opinions. I have observations, I said carefully. I try to keep them separate. And when you can't? I met his eyes for a moment. I'd stopped doing that at some point, the looking at the floor protocol, and I wasn't sure when. Then I keep them to myself. Even now. The corridor was quiet. The palace around us was enormous and full of important people and all their complicated agendas. And in this corridor, it was just him and me and a cleaning caddy and 2 years of noticing things from the background. Even now, I said. Then, most of the time. The not-quite smile again, closer this time. Good night, Siravas, he said. Good night, Your Highness. I should have been smarter about what I was feeling. I knew the rules, not just palace protocol rules, though those existed and were unambiguous. I mean the real rules, the ones written into the structure of the world. A maid from the outer belt settlements does not develop feelings for the Alpha King of the Galactic Compact. That's not a love story. That's a misunderstanding of how things work. I understood how things worked. But understanding how things work and managing what you feel about them are different disciplines, and I've always been better at the first than the second. I did not tell Yelena about the East Wing corridor conversation. She would have said something wise and true, and I wasn't ready to hear it. Week 6 brought the formal elimination round. This was the council's structure. At the 6-week mark, the king would formally reduce the selection to a final group. The council recommended a final 5 or final 10. They hadn't agreed on the number, from which the formal declaration would be made within the following 2 weeks. The pressure on everyone intensified. The princesses knew, they all knew, the diplomatic channels knew, the palace knew. What the selection protocol didn't account for, and what became evident to anyone paying attention, was that the king had not given the council any indication of his preferences. They'd expected signals by now, particular interest in certain candidates, recurring requests for specific audiences, the kind of behavioral data that selection processes are designed to generate. They had nothing. He'd been equitable, consistently, carefully equitable. Every princess received the same genuine engagement and the same professional consideration. The envoys escalated. They went back to the advisory board with a formal request. The king needed to demonstrate progress in the selection process. The political consequences of indecision were beginning to accumulate. Several of the sovereign systems had populations monitoring the selection. Extended uncertainty was generating speculation that was not flattering to the compact. The king's response this time, as relayed through Yelena's channels, the timeline will be met. Nothing else. It was Yelena who first noticed something was wrong. The technical team has been flagging something for 2 weeks, she said at breakfast. Her voice was lower than usual. "In the basement levels, the energy containment trials." "What kind of something?" "Fluctuations, minor ones, but the intervals are getting shorter." I put down my cup. "What does that mean?" "I don't know. I'm not an energy technician, but the intervals getting shorter means whatever's happening is escalating." She looked at me. Two of the technicians put in requests for emergency consultation with an external specialist. Both requests were denied by palace administration. Too much external access to secure systems during the selection period. "That seems like bad prioritization." "That seems like catastrophically bad prioritization," she said quietly. "But I could be wrong. I don't know what I don't know about energy containment." "Who would know?" "Above my level," she said, "well above." The fluctuation became unignorable on a Tuesday night. I was asleep when it happened. The entire East Wing trembled, not violently, more like the building took a breath it shouldn't have taken. Equipment rattled. Lights flickered to emergency backup. And then, 14 seconds later, everything normalized, and the palace systems ran a standard diagnostic and reported minor seismic activity, which was what palace administration told everyone the next morning. But I'd grown up in the outer belt settlements, where the infrastructure was old and underfunded, and where you learned to read the difference between a building settling and a building in distress. That wasn't seismic. Yelena found me in the corridor at 5 a.m. You felt it. What was that? I don't know, but the technical wing was the origin point. I know two people who work down there and neither of them showed up for breakfast. Part 4. What lives in the basement? What I'm going to tell you next, I know how it sounds. I know that a maid noticing something that trained advisors and official systems missed sounds like the kind of story people tell when they want to make a point about what power gets wrong. And maybe it is, but it happened the way it happened. The second fluctuation came 3 days after the first, stronger this time. Not dangerous, still within what the palace's primary structure could absorb, but longer, 22 seconds of that wrong breath feeling. This time, 3 rooms of lighting in the East Wing failed to restore. This time, one of Princess Dash's security systems threw a cascade alert that her team spent an hour tracing to what they characterized as infrastructure interference. This time, I went looking. I want to be clear about what I was doing. I wasn't being heroic. I wasn't making a brave decision. I was doing what I always do when something feels wrong. I was trying to understand it. Growing up the way I did, in places where nobody official explained anything to you, you learned to gather information directly or you didn't have it. I knew the basement levels from a cleaning assignment 6 months earlier, a deep maintenance cycle that took the service team through sections most staff never saw. I knew where the corridors went and where they didn't, and where the locked sections were. The locked section nearest the technical wing had a maintenance access panel. Specifically, a ventilation access panel designed for service staff use during equipment maintenance. I am very small, and I have spent 2 years learning to move through spaces that weren't arranged for me. What I found in the technical wing was not a minor research experiment. The energy containment system, I don't have the technical vocabulary to describe it properly, and anything I say is going to be approximation, but I'll try. It was a lattice, a containment lattice for something that generated enormous amounts of gravitational energy. The researchers, from what I could piece together from the documentation visible on their systems, were trying to develop a portable gravitational focusing array, technology that would have massive implications for space travel, manufacturing, weapons systems. The lattice was failing. Not catastrophically, not yet. But the intervals between fluctuations were shortening, because the primary containment field was degrading in a specific pattern. I could see it on the monitoring displays. These cascading waves of destabilization that were getting incrementally more severe. The two technicians who hadn't shown up to breakfast were there, awake, working, surrounded by diagnostic equipment. They'd been down here continuously for 3 days. I don't know what made me do what I did next. Something in me just decided. I knocked on the transparent partition. Both of them spun around. The senior one, a woman about 40, with the light-scorched skin of someone who'd spent years working near high-energy equipment, stared at me with an expression that moved from shock to anger to something more complicated. "How did you?" "The ventilation panel," I said. "I'm service staff. I know the access points." I looked at the monitoring displays. "How long before the lattice fails?" She stared at me. "You can't be down here." "How long?" The two technicians exchanged a look. Something in my tone, maybe, whatever lives in people's voices when they're not asking a casual question. "At current degradation rate," the junior technician said, "between 4 and 7 days, but," he hesitated. "But what?" "But we have an escalating pattern. The degradation isn't linear. If it follows the model we're seeing, it could compress to under 40 hours. And if it fails?" The senior technician sat down heavily. "It won't destroy the palace. The containment field will release, not explode. But the gravitational release will." She thought about how to explain it to someone without her training. "Imagine a pressure wave, not explosive but concentrated. The immediate area around the lattice would experience a gravitational spike." "Which means?" "Anyone in range experiences compression force, potentially fatal." She rubbed her eyes. "We've been trying to get an emergency external specialist here for a week. All requests denied. We've been managing it manually, but we are 2 people who have been awake for 70 hours and we cannot." She stopped, looked at me. "Your service staff," she said. It wasn't a question, more like an observation she was processing. "Yes." "Why are you here?" "Because something felt wrong, and nobody official seemed to be addressing it." Another long look. "You need to go to someone official." "I know," I said. "That's where I'm going."